Many people want to know what the entity framework is doing with the database for certain operations. And fortunately, this version of the entity framework has several places where you can tap in to see the SQL statements that are going to SQL Server. We'll look at one easy approach, which is to use a log property that is now exposed on the database member of a DB context. But I also want to show you some more advanced logging that you can do, not just for the entity framework, but with other components on your server. I'll do this using Glimpse, which is a popular open source project you can plug into an MVC application to see what is happening on your server. And Glimpse can look at just about anything. Back inside of Visual Studio, let's delete the Books2 controller that I created just so we could see what the scaffolder did for async actions, and then swing over into our BooksDB data context. Let's say that I really want to know what this DB context is doing with SQL Server. If that's the case, I can go to the database property that is a part of this context and look at the log property. I'm doing this in the constructor, so every instance of DB context will be logging something. Log is a property of type action of string. That means you can assign to it a method that takes a string parameter and returns void. That method can do anything at once with the string parameter. And what will be in that string parameter? Well, every time the entity framework sends a query to SQL Server, some sort of instruction, it will also invoke this action and pass that instruction into it. So if I write a simple Lambda expression that says, given that string the SQL, I want to debug.write that SQL, that will allow it to appear in the Visual Studio debug output when I'm running with the debugger. Debug, of course, being in the system.diagnostics namespace. Let's try it out real quick. I will F5 the application. And while that's coming up, let me come back into Visual Studio and make sure that the output window appears. Perhaps drag it over here where it has some more space. And now over in the application, go to Books. That will show me the one book in the database. And if I swing back into Visual Studio, I will now see all the queries that went to the database during the execution of that page. And I can see there's more than one. That's because the first time that I use the entity framework here, it's going to look in the migration history table to make sure that the database schema and my model is in sync. But that only happens once, and once all that bookkeeping is done, I can start to see the queries related to the business of my application, which is here's the query that selects all the books. I can see that it was executed asynchronously, and then it took 3 milliseconds. Let's clear this window and refresh the page. Now we won't be cluttered up with all those other queries. I can clearly see there's one query that is sent by this page. It's the query to retrieve all of the books. So the log property, very easy to use. And again, you don't have to write a simple Lambda expression here. You could write a full named method that takes a string parameter, and it could take that SQL and save it to a log file, or try to parse it and see how many milliseconds the command took. And anything, let's say over 2000 milliseconds, maybe only that gets logged. You can do anything you like there. Another way to get insight into what the entity framework is doing, and indeed what the MVC framework itself is doing, is to install Glimpse. The easiest way to install Glimpse is to install the NuGet package. So I will do a search for Glimpse. The package that I currently want is glimpse.mvc4. I'm sure it won't be too long until Glimpse updates itself with an MVC5 package, but it turns out the MVC4 package still works against MVC5. Not all the features are there, but it's pretty good. And the other thing I want to install is the glimpse.ef6 package. This will give me some insight into what the entity framework is doing. There's a number of different Glimpse packages out there that you can add in once you've added the Glimpse core. And those different packages can give you information about the different technologies that you might be using in an application. For instance, there's a Glimpse package for Signal R and one for log.net. But I have what I need, which is Glimpse EF6, Glimpse MVC4. Now I have a nice little README page here that will give me some additional information on configuring Glimpse. One change I am going to need to make is inside of the Books controller. Unfortunately, currently, Glimpse and Async Entity Framework API, they don't mix. So I'm going to temporarily return this index action to being a non-async method. Remove the async method, remove the await keyword. And now I want to build the application and run the application. By default, Glimpse will not provide any information about what is happening until I go to glimpse.axd, a special handler that is installed, and turn Glimpse on. This is only enabled for local requests by default, so you have to do this against your local server and not a remote server. But once Glimpse is on, now I should be able to come to any page and see the Glimpse heads-up display, which will give me some basic information about the request and how long it took, some basic information about the host and what controller action executed, all sorts of timing information. If I want even more detail, I can open up a pop-up window with Glimpse. On this small screen size, however, it's scrolled off a little bit to the right, so I cannot see it. It's over here, the big G. If I click this, I can open up this window, which is very reminiscent of the developer tools, but I will pop that window out and we can begin to see all sorts of interesting information in here. All of my web.config settings are available, the operating environment, what is executing on the server, what controller actions. I can also look at routes, what routes were evaluated, what route was chosen. And then there's a timeline view, which breaks down different pieces of the request lifecycle to show me where my time is taken. And now if I go to a page that's using the entity framework to perform some queries, Glimpse can also track that. The SQL tab will light up, and I can come in and see all the information about what queries were executed and how long they took. So once again, we just started this application. The entity framework is doing some bookkeeping and checking on the migration history table. But down here at the bottom, I can again see the important query, which is selecting all the books. Still not taking much time, 1.01 milliseconds. So Glimpse is a wonderful tool to get some insight into what is happening on your server, not just with the entity framework, but also with AJAX calls and what your views are doing. All you need to do is install a few Glimpse packages, turn on Glimpse, and then you'll have this nice heads-up display in the bottom of the browser.